Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear WHO colleagues and colleagues also from other UN organizations. Welcome to the 93rd Global Health Histories Seminar. We are very excited today to continue a series that was started in 2004 at the level of WHO headquarters, together with the regional offices and between the Collaborating Center for Global Health Histories at the University of York, and there through Professor Sanjoy Bhattacharya, who cannot be with us today, unfortunately, and the WHO. This is a long-standing and exciting series which is traveling through the regions and headquarters over the course of the year. And the mission of these seminars is to understand the social, historical, cultural context of health in the global public health community, to better respond to our challenges and to help us shape a healthier future. So looking into the history of public health to help us shape the future is the idea of these seminars. And this seminar is part of a series that we have here at WHO Europe and which focuses on the cultural context of health. Our experience of health and our interactions with each other and those who care for us are really very informed and influenced by the way that we see culture, how culture shapes us, and how we react in the context we live. We know that all health professionals and public health organizations are confronted with that every day, but we very rarely articulate this, and we very rarely look at the specific areas that may really influence the way that our responses to health and our responses to disease are shaped. You know that at WHO Europe we have launched about 18 months ago a new project on the cultural context of health. That project is led by Dr. Niels Fietje, who is here to moderate today. And this is really a project that helps us look at systematically the interdisciplinary research at the interface of culture and health, and also see how can we understand how culture impacts health and how will that shape our programs and the way that we advise governments. Now, today's topic is in the series of culture and health. We had a very exciting one dealing with Ebola and our response and the individual responses to Ebola in the context of culture. Today we look at another topic that really needs absolutely no introduction at all, and that is migration. Now, in the last few months, and actually over a longer period of time in the last 2 years, migration has been on the forefront of the news, especially recently, as more and more people escape the conflict zones further south and hope to find a better future in Europe. The health consequences of mass migration are being examined and explored, and here I just need to refer to a series that Dr. Santino Severoni was very strongly spearheading together with the Health Evidence Network on the public health aspects of migration and health. So there are publications out there, but we're only beginning to really understand what that means. To help us explore the cultural context of migration and perhaps the cultural issues surrounding migration a bit better, we have two eminent speakers today. The first is Dr. Fern Elsdon-Baker from Newman University in Birmingham, the UK. She's the director of a center that has a fascinating name, and I really need to explore this further. She's the director of the Center for Science, Knowledge, and Belief in Society. And I think that is an amazing title, and of course something that we in public health really should be aligning ourselves with. And she's the principal investigator of a major grant which is exploring the popular debates around evolution and religion. And I just see another Global Health History Seminar theme coming on, because that is a really topical and fascinating area too, where culture also plays a huge role. From WHO Europe, we have our very own Dr. Santino Severoni. He's the coordinator of public health and migration based at the Venice office, and he is responsible for a huge project that has really gained pace, the public health aspects of migration in Europe, FAME. We will hear more about this from Santino, and of course I'm sure he will refer to the ministerial summit that is happening in less than 2 weeks' time in Italy on this very topic. So we will be welcoming these two speakers. We will have time for questions, but before we go there, I would like to ask Niels Fietje to please not only moderate the session, but also give us some information and brief instructions on how you can interact online with today's seminar. So over to you, Niels, and then over to our exciting speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and welcome to all of you who are joining us, both in this room and hopefully on the internet. We're going to be trying something slightly new today, which is a way to interface with the panel, to ask questions with the panel, both online and also in this room. So normally at this stage, you'll hear the moderator say, please switch off your phones, please put them to silent. I'm not going to ask you to do that. I'm going to ask you to take out your phones, if you can. And I'm going to ask you to go to a website, and I'll explain to you how you can interface with that in a second. So I'll give you a second to grab your phones. In the meantime, to all those people who are tuning in on the live stream, on the web stream, you should be seeing the site that we have, the page that we have on the slide here. And you should have a little widget on the side which will enable you to ask questions to the panel. So if you hear something interesting and you think it might be worth following up with a question, just plug it into that text box, make sure you press send, and we'll be able to get it behind the scenes. We'll be looking at the questions, and then at the end of the session we'll put them on the screen here, and we'll be able to ask those questions from our online audience. As I said, if you are here, obviously we can do this the old-fashioned way. You can raise your hand. We'll get you to ask your questions. But if you feel that you're more comfortable asking it online, asking it via this interface, go to slido.com. Oh, in fact, I think it's the website is actually www.sly.do. So that's www.sly.do. And you should get this widget that you see there on your phone or on your tablet. And you don't have to register. You don't have to do anything. You just type in your question, and you'll be able to see it on the screen at the end of the seminar. So it's a really simple, straightforward way to interface with today's discussion. We really encourage you to give it a shot. As I say, the website, the URL that you'll be using is www.sli.do. And the hashtag that you'll be using to enter the event code is hashtag WHO Euro. Okay, so I see some people nodding in the audience. Looks like some people are logged in. Looks like it's working. Okay, fantastic. Thumbs up. That's great. That's all I've got to say at this point. I will. Oh yeah, there's a couple more things. You can post anonymously if you want. You can post during the presentation, so don't feel like you have to wait till the end. If you've got a good question, do type it in. And if you are more old-fashioned and you want to use hashtags, you can also send questions via Twitter or via email. So there's plenty of ways for you to interact with the seminar. Hopefully we've got all the bases covered, and hopefully it'll enable us to have a good conversation at the end of the presentations. But that's it from me. And our first speaker is Fern. Please take it away.
There we go. Thank you. I may look like I'm technologically adept because I'm holding an iPad, but it's just the front. Okay, so thank you for the very kind introductions. Just before I start, just to give a little bit of a background to where I'm coming from in terms of the research. I'm actually more of a philosopher who's historically informed in their work. And what I'll be doing today is drawing on some of our wider research team's work, which is coming from sociological, psychological, historical and philosophical perspectives. And what we're trying to achieve is understand the way that individuals and groups relate to and understand the relationship between science and religion in society. So that's really where we're coming from in terms of our research. So what I really want to do today is kind of take a top level view about things that we might want to consider when we're thinking about new issues in terms of migration and healthcare in Europe. So I'll be talking a little bit about the way that the framing of societal discourses and narratives could be driving what we refer to as implicit biases and assumptions within healthcare provision, specifically with regards to certain key migrant groups. Now I'll explain what I mean in more detail as we go through. As many of you will no doubt be aware, this is a relatively new area of study, and from a policy and migration perspective, situations are fast-moving and fluid. So what I really want to do today is ask some questions about how we might think differently about approaching issues in relation to health and current patterns of migration, what broader societal narratives may have an impact on healthcare provision and access, and finally the ways in which we might start to gain a better understanding in terms of thinking about what are currently rather ill-defined notions of cultural barriers that impact on individuals accessing healthcare. So if I... There we go. So am I standing in front of my own slides? Sorry? No. It's just that if people can see them, if I'm standing in front of them. Okay, I shall move out of the way slightly. Okay, thank you. Right. Okay, so there's my first point is really the limitation in terms of the data. As I'm sure a number of you have discussed in other forums like this, there is an acknowledged need for considerably more data in terms of understanding the impact of migration on health, migrant experience, and barriers to access. There have been a number of calls for research in this area that include more comprehensive intersectional analysis, which examine the multiple dimensions and factors with regard migrants' individual or group identity, their lived experience, and the broader impact of social relations. Though perhaps this is in some way a distant aim, and there are significant implications for how this might be achieved across different country contexts. There are also growing concerns over the past decades that EU populations in particular are increasingly less open to migration from non-white ethnic groups, and that there has been a removal of funding or even a reversal of policies which were previously favourable towards multicultural perspectives. The few intersectional studies conducted to date are beginning to suggest and recognise that differing migration status and ethnicity of migrant groups can potentially have an impact on issues such as registering with healthcare providers or use of primary and secondary health services. We therefore clearly need to take a more holistic approach to assessing the role of broader structural, institutional, cultural and societal factors that might impact threefold on healthcare practice and delivery, individual choices about accessing healthcare and decision-making about their own treatment and care, and also the impact of migrants' lived experience in terms of wellbeing and health. The focus of these kind of intersectional research undertaken to date, or that has been highlighted as a priority, tends to be ethnicity, migration status, or to a degree more so gender. This draws on research undertaken in the US, particularly looking at the role that race can play in inequity and inequality in terms of healthcare. However, in Europe today, another cultural context is perhaps becoming more relevant as a contributing factor to healthcare inequalities, namely religion. Arguably, religion, and specifically Islam, is now increasingly perceived in racialised ways. In particular, those that are not seen to be ethnically European may be attributed identities that relate to religion rather than ethnicity, regardless of their own individual religiosity or their own individual religious beliefs. And actually, we're starting to see this in some of the hate crime that's occurring. There are a number of recent examples, for example, in the US, where people who are non-Muslim are being targeted as Muslims. So there is this kind of ethnicisation, racialisation of religion. Against the backdrop in the past few decades, which has seen the normalisation of anti-Muslim rhetoric across Europe and the West, this reduction of individuals to one primary religious identity is part of a broader process of discrimination and social exclusion. Obviously, it's recognised that social exclusion can have a considerable impact on health, well-being and premature death. Social exclusion is not just related to socioeconomic status. Racism, discrimination, stigmatisation and hostility can all result in the exclusion of individuals, groups or communities from the benefits available to wider society. Another key issue when we're thinking about religion and healthcare is to consider the way in which people's beliefs or worldviews can also play a significant role in the way patients might think about ethical decision-making or approaches to their own or their family's health, their well-being and their care. Though again, there is very little discussion in the relevant literature of the role that religious identity might play here in terms of migrant communities. Furthermore, religion may form an important lens through which to analyse the processes that impact on issues relating to well-being as well as healthcare, especially given that in terms of certain new migrant groups coming into Europe, individuals may be moving from societies where religion, religious identity and religiosity play a significantly greater role in their day-to-day lives and their worldviews than those in the predominantly overtly secular or lower religiosity countries within Europe. This, of course, can play a role in intra-European migration, for example, the movement of Polish Catholics to more secular contexts like Norway or the UK. Alternatively, this might be from outside of Europe, and obviously most prevalent in the headlines at the moment is the Syrian refugee crisis. It's hard to ignore the role that anti-Muslim sentiment plays in the current framing of debates around migration into Europe, yet very few of the studies I've seen to date make mention of the role of these kind of religious identities and the way they might play out in terms of healthcare literacy interventions aimed at migrants, discrimination or implicit biases towards migrant patients, or the cultural competencies of healthcare workers. So, cultural competency, obviously there's a recognition that there is a growing need for increased cultural competency as part of the best practice in health service provision for migrant communities. It clearly plays a key role in this. But this must go beyond merely ascribing a list of cultural characteristics to a group. Quite often in these kind of interventions, groups, for example, Muslims, are treated as a monolithic, homogeneous kind of entity. And this itself can lead to a process of stereotyping and discrimination. There has been very little work that's been done to assess cultural competency-based interventions, and it's very difficult for us to know how effectively these kinds of interventions are being implemented across different country contexts. As Madlovsky et al. In 2012 argue, apart from the practical obstacles to access, other more subtle barriers can undermine the effective delivery of health services. Therefore, a starting point for cultural competency is for health workers to be aware of and gain insight into their own culture, which would then allow an insight into the implicit assumptions they may be making. Others have argued that clinicians need to be more aware of religious discrimination in the multivariate ways that it can manifest. It's not always overt anti-Muslim sentiment that we're seeing. It's further noted that, ironically, the very term Muslim is ambiguous in health literature and is often merged with ethnic or racial group identity rather than used to refer to people distinguished by beliefs, practices or affiliations. It's this non-differentiation between religious identity and ethnicity that is deserving of more attention. A religious identity, after all, can encompass so much more than a geographically located cultural identity. Indeed, when we are discussing any religious worldview, it's important to note that interpretations are not uniform. For example, the term Muslim could indicate or include a migrant from around 57 Muslim majority countries or countless Muslim minority contexts. Religious identities cannot be reduced to forms of cultural practice, for example, diet, prayer frequency or modesty, because even adherence to these kind of performative aspects of religion can be very diverse. Religious identities incorporate a whole range of epistemic, ethical and ontological ways of viewing and thinking about the world. They can also incorporate a reflection of wider geopolitical concerns. This means that prejudices or assumptions about one religious worldview or identity can manifest in ways that are quite complicated or are based on implicit biases. Therefore, the kind of cultural reflexivity that's expected as part of cultural competency interventions or training also needs to reflect this. So I just want to unpack this notion of implicit bias a bit more. So implicit biases are biases that operate at the level below conscious awareness and impact on our behaviour towards our decision-making about and our understanding of others. So in particular, I want to think about this in the way that this relates to individual belief systems as opposed to their ethnicity, in order to give some insight into how prejudices and discrimination that are prevalent within commonplace societal discourses could lead to assumptions about the role of religion in individuals' day-to-day lives, which then in turn would obviously impact on decision-making with regards to health and well-being. Principally, I'm thinking about how these kind of perceptions or prejudices might affect individuals or institutions when approaching research, policy decision-making, or delivery of services. So I'm thinking about this in a multi-layered way. These may manifest as implicit biases we hold towards certain groups, and they can come out when we're thinking about science and medicine and its relationship with religious belief perspectives. As studies of mental health provision in relation to race in the US have shown these kind of biases can manifest in a number of ways, including over-pathologizing biases and minimization biases. These kind of biases don't just manifest at the level of individual clinicians or healthcare practitioners, but also occur when unfounded assumptions or prejudices are normalized across service provision at an institutional level. To give you an example of the kind of biases I mean, I'll just use an example from a paper by Laird, which I'll give you the reference for at the end. So this example is talking about how clinicians who encounter girls who wear headscarves or ask for the same gender providers or consult with male relatives when making decisions, they may be often incorrectly are interpreting the girl as oppressed, abused or traditional, when, which is in a negative context, in her understanding of sexuality, gender roles and morality. So this is an obvious example of the kind of bias we might see when generalisations are made from stereotypical perceptions relating to an obvious identity marker, so in this case, wearing of a headscarf. But I want to examine some of the more subtle ways in which implicit biases might affect our everyday thinking about how an individual's religious worldview relates to their health, well-being, their ability to make reasoned decisions about their healthcare, or the kinds of hidden cultural barriers that might impede migrants' engagement with medicine and healthcare beyond just language proficiency. To do this, I'm going to use two slightly abstract examples of the kind of assumptions we might make about religious identities from an arguably secular position. To be clear, I am not just talking about overt anti-religious sentiment here. Often we are unaware we are basing our decisions on these kinds of implicit biases, or even that we might hold such biased perspectives. So I've picked two examples of common cultural narratives within research literature. One perhaps we might see as slightly more kind of negative towards religion, and the other is perhaps more pro towards religion, just to give you an idea of how these biases might work in two different ways. Okay, so this example is these are a number of newspaper articles that relate to some research that came out about 2 years ago. And I picked these, I mean, I could criticise these in many ways. I mean, there's a number of people who already have criticised these. It's based on a meta-analysis of 63 studies looking at the relationship between religious belief and IQ from the 1920s onwards. Obviously, the core critique is the very notion of IQ itself and the socioeconomic bias. But I think this is a particularly good example because if you look here at this side, here, the Guardian comment is free article. You've got a poll with members of the public polling yes or no about whether or not they believe religious people are less intelligent than the atheists, and 74% say yes, which is a very interesting result. So what I want to do today is really look at how this kind of this dissemination of research really fits in with a kind of very normalised view of the inevitable clash between religious thought and rational thought. This is clearly not a new debate, but it's gained a certain cultural capital in the past few decades, in part partly due to the prevalence of the Secularization thesis. In very basic terms, this is an argument that as the world modernises, it will become increasingly secular. And Europe as a region is often held up as a primary example of this process. This notion of modernisation is inevitably bound up with notions of societal, scientific and technological progress. There are a number of critiques of this thesis, and its support itself has perhaps declined in the past decade in face of new spiritual movements and increased evangelical Christianity and the focus on Islam worldwide. It's also becoming much clearer that non-religious is not the same as non-belief. One important aspect of these debates is the role of private and public space religion and how this links to more insidious clash of civilizations style rhetoric. The basic position here being that Islam adopts a medieval worldview whereby religion is an important factor in every aspect of day-to-day lives, both public and private. Often, of course, these narratives do not take into account differing access to mass migration and other development inequity and inequity-related aspects of, in terms of the communities migrating in from, in some cases, some of the poorest regions of the world. It is this kind of widely expressed reductionist narrative that is a primary concern when it comes to new Muslim migrant groups and healthcare decision-making. Clearly, this broader societal discourse that religion and certain types of public religion are on the decline due to some kind of Enlightenment-style view of societal progress has an impact on the way that we might view those who hold different worldviews to ourselves. In a clinical setting where systems of cultural authority and power are clearly geared more towards this conceptualization of modernity, that at its bedrock is wedded to a notion of scientific progress, these wider societal discourses are bound to play a role in the implicit biases clinicians or healthcare professionals make about patients and their family for whom religion, religiosity or religious worldviews might play an essentially different role. Science and medicine, rightly or wrongly, are often perceived to be part of the European secular identity. Arguably, if we start to understand science, not just as a practice, but as a form of cultural identity, this identity needs to feature in the way we think about cultural competency in healthcare. Going back to the earlier point I referred to, the starting point for healthcare workers is a need to gain insight into their own culture. Then we also need to factor in the institutional culture and scientific worldview within which health workers, researchers, policy decision makers are operating as well. This cuts two ways. Firstly, there may be a lack of understanding of certain tenets of faith which are key to patients' well-being in these settings. It's this aspect of current thinking around cultural competency is perhaps most well placed to address. This kind of stereotyping might often be based on anecdote as opposed to research. So, for example, it could be an assumption that certain communities are resistant to termination of pregnancy when actually the research data shows this isn't the case. However, conversely, there might also be a process of projection of an implicit cultural assumption that plays into and leads to ultimately discrimination, or to patients feeling that they cannot discuss aspects of their religious worldviews in a clinical setting. So there's a study done in 2010 that gives a really good example of this, looking at Muslim Pakistani patients in Yorkshire in the UK. So these are patients with long-term illnesses. And the paper, which again I will give you the reference to at the end, highlights that there was a diversity of ways in which religious values played out in patients' decision-making. Some patients who identify as Muslim Pakistani don't use religious values as part of their decision-making at all and see this as unimportant. And although over half of the participants involved did see religious values as part of that decision-making, there was a diversity within that group about how that played out. So it's not always that religious values are the primary or central decision-making factor. So the participants in this study had a range of ways in which their religious identity factored into their decision-making, along with other social and cultural factors. However, the study highlighted that the way that stereotyping impacts on clinicians' interactions with specific communities, and they suggested that actually professional perceptions drew on patients' presumed social identity rather than on their actual circumstances or health needs. So this is what I mean by projection, where clinicians are assuming that the primary decision-making factor is religion. It's not always the case. It's not something that they're not necessarily engaging in a dialogue with the patient about. Clearly, religious worldviews can and do play a role in healthcare decision-making, given the kinds of potentially life-changing ethical decisions that are being made in these contexts. But conversely, clinicians could also be projecting negative assumptions concerning religious or cultural decision-making processes onto patients. And I wonder if this could be playing a similar role to race or ethnicity in both minimisation and over-pathologising biases. This leads me on to my next example of the kind of implicit bias that could be at play when we think about well-being, religiosity and migration. I want to examine how certain assumptions about positive benefits of religiosity could also lead to a narrow view of complex interrelated factors. So this is really, I just want to use an example of religious coping. So there's been consensus over the past few decades that religiosity often leads to higher subjective well-being. The underlying assumption is that being religious is positively associated with an individual's happiness. It is also argued that religious coping is related to various health outcomes, including lower rates of depression and overall better mental and physical health. There are a number of reasons suggested as to why this might be the case, ranging from an increase in social support and respect from others within society, or an individual's beliefs giving them a sense of meaning or purpose in life. There are evidently benefits to religiosity, and this is reflected in a large number of the literature concerning cultural competency in healthcare precision. It's also clear that the assumption that an individual's religious identity always confers health benefits, regardless of individual circumstances or other social factors, could if continued down that road, it could actually lead to minimisation biases, or, and there is some evidence of inequity in healthcare provision, because there is an assumption that religious communities will provide support that isn't actually there. However, some research done by Dinah points out that much of the past work on religion and subjective well-being has been conducted in the United States, which is a moderately religious nation and a very religious nation relative to most other wealthy nations in the world. They conducted a study that examined data from across 154 countries worldwide, and this study suggests that religious people are more likely to prosper in terms of subjective well-being if they live in religious societies rather than non-religious societies. And they state that greater religiosity is associated with more negative feelings in the least religious nations and less negative feelings in the most religious nations. So their analysis suggests that subjective well-being in its relationship to individual religiosity is most beneficial when it's congruent with the culture in which people are living. The implications of this research are potentially quite significant in terms of the context of migration into Europe. We need to ask, what does it mean to migrate from a country context where religiosity has higher social capital to countries that may view religion either as a kind of take it or leave it personal choice, or in some ways, country contexts where religion is viewed quite negatively. Specifically, this is important if a consequence of migration is that an overt religious identity or religiosity does not mean you will gain respect from wider society or the well-being benefits that higher levels of social standing or inclusion may bring with it. Part of the issue here, of course, is that most of the research in these fields tends to be undertaken through a majority Western, Christian or secular framing. The assumption that this might lead to is that religiosity accords higher resilience within communities that are actually fragmented, suffering from various forms of social exclusion and increasingly subject to discrimination, all of which can have profound impacts on health and well-being. So this gives a good example of the kind of way in which stereotyping or implicit biases towards individual patients may be relatively benign or positive towards individuals' worldviews or religion. But in this instance, the assumption that religiosity automatically confers higher subjective well-being could have serious impacts in terms of inequity of healthcare provision or minimisation biases, particularly in assessing mental health and well-being. Okay, so in conclusion, the two examples I've used might seem rather abstract. How we are discussing healthcare and we're not doing so in a cultural vacuum. So just to conclude, I've got 4 key points. Firstly, we need to take into account that religious discrimination, just as much as ethnic or gender-based discrimination, can lead to social exclusion, and this has inevitable impacts on well-being and healthcare. The second is more of a reflexive point. Science and medicine are intertwined with Western secular cultural identity in a way that may contribute to implicit biases in healthcare provision, but also contribute to the conceptualisation of healthcare spaces as Western, secular or Christian-centric. Heavily linked into this are the different attitudes across Europe and internationally to seeing religion as part of an active process within a public space, not just as a private, personal concern. Thirdly, there is evidence that there are positives to being part of a broader religious community, but these are potentially contingent on the way religion is viewed within wider society. Thus, the very act of migration from a highly religious context to a broadly non-religious context within Europe could impact negatively on well-being, and this would then in turn contribute to other factors such as discrimination. Clearly, there's need for more research and assessment of best practice to be done here. Combined with implicit biases that are potentially at play in healthcare provision, a lack of recognition of individuals' religious identity in healthcare settings could have profound implications. Cultural competency training needs to build awareness of broader cultural, social and geopolitical factors, not just simply list religious practices or endorse stereotypical or reductionist reflections of religious worldviews. This will lead to a situation whereby cultural competency can be reduced to being seen as serving spiritual needs of patients without understanding the complex structural issues that can lead to patients feeling like an outsider in Western medicalised spaces. It could also lead to an easy dismissal of the biases that might be at play at all levels of healthcare provision, policy and practice. Conversely, we need to recognise that the barriers to accessing healthcare go well beyond issues such as language proficiency. Health, medicine and science themselves are often overtly or covertly framed as opposing or oppositional to religious perspectives, worldviews or practices. However, in reality, they don't have to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fern. Very interesting kickoff, very stimulating, and some tough questions, I think, for us to follow. Santino is going to come now with his presentation from a more directly WHO practical implementation side of things. So, Santino, please take it away.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Claudia, for the nice presentation of before. Yeah, indeed. I've been asked to come and share some of the practical experience we are observing since we start to work on health and migration in our region. And we are very much busy in working with countries and with partners. And I have to say that this is perceived, but it is indeed also a new area of work, at least with the structured approach we are trying to promote here at the regional office, is a new area of work for WHO. Probably never like before in this region we were promoting certain principle of equity and looking to better governance, universal coverage. So key really principle supporting our public health work on the ground. With my presentation, I thought to share with you some very basic data in order to give you the idea of what is the reality about migration, and then to link that with a stereotype, what actually we need to confront, even us, public health, when we are going to the country, because the issue of public health aspect of migration, it's a very complex area of work, because our competence is very limited to the health component of a cake of competence or portfolio of activities which are usually run by other sectors, interior, labor, education, social sector. So there is a really a very major effort which need to be put, to understand ourselves, how to really engage into this process and this work, but also how to build up the ownership of the Ministry of Health of the country where we are working, where in many cases they don't have the perception that they have a role to play, but they feel in a very traditional that we are called to intervene only when there is a public health, a concrete health issues to be addressed. I would like to start by saying that when we're talking about migration, migrants, we're talking about people. When we're talking about migration, public health aspect of migration, we tend to forget that, because the approach is that we are categorizing or try to categorize migrants according to an administrative categorization in order to define administratively the level of entitlement of service access and the level of health spending. Are those people entitled to receive my health spending and to receive access to services? Well, when we're talking about migrants, in reality, we're talking about us. Yeah. We are talking about, there is no pointer. Yeah. So we are talking about the society. We're talking about all people more lucky or some less lucky, those which are forced to migrate. And again, when we are talking about migration and migrants, we tend to compound our understanding, our believing that people migrate only to save their life, because they need to save their life. So they are escaping from bombing, from disasters, from persecution. This is true, but the main engine for migration is development. And we've been investing all our life doing this job into promoting development. So we promote development, people develop, and they look for more, for better, as all of us. And this cannot be a problem. So we need to have a proactive, a different type of understanding, and to really promote a different type of thinking around migration and public health aspect as well. Now, allow me to really simplify, not to be simplistic, but to simplify as I like to define myself a country doctor, because I like to make my hands dirty with problems. So if I need to consider that I need to rent a service to population, I need to know what population I need to face when I'm practicing my work. And this is the population I'm facing. That today, in our region, 1 every 12 is not born into this region. That there are people on the move for a number of reasons. So there are people which they are currently in a status of vulnerability. They are not vulnerable because they're born like that, but they are contextually, because of the situation they're facing, into a very critical situation. So we need to have an ad hoc, special, tailored, targeted intervention to support those people in difficulty. But we are living in a context where 8% of our people are migrants. So if I'm a GP, the front line of the healthcare services, can I go today to practice without having zero knowledge of what I've been hearing before from professor or concept of multiculturality? I will have probably female patients, Muslim, Hindu. So there is a demographic diversity that we are confronting with that public health cannot forget any longer. Who they are. We tend to say those people are disease carriers. Those people are coming to exploit. Sorry, I'm Italian, you know, I need to move. Talking about culture. When we talk who they are, well, we tend to think that those are disease carriers, people, that they are people which they're going to abuse our systems, health system or any system of our country. In reality, those are people that, if you look at the age curve, they are mainly young and probably healthy. So they are people which very likely they're going to have an active, positive contribution to the growing of our society, our economic performance, and we have evidence, data already proving that. But strangely, maybe professor can help us to understand that even media forget to communicate those informations. Or if they are appearing, they are very marginalized at the second, third page, while the front page is always talking about danger related to migration. This is a Eurostat data. There is a projection. It's a simulation, so it's hypothetical. But according to the data available, without the current migration phenomenon, we're supposed to be in a population decline already in 2012. With the current migration phenomenon, we're supposed to start to be concerned in 2035. All right, yeah. Perceptions. Allow me to, few seconds, play with me, please. I want to test, we are in an institution which by definition is multicultural. We have a different understanding about this complexity, but I want to play a bit with you. Please read with me. They are dirty, noisy, they are very rare in terms of quality of life, interpersonal relationship, practicing primitive religious ritual, neglecting children education, marginalizing the role of women within family. I would like to ask to you or anybody of you to tell me, please empty your imagination, who we are talking about. Say. Hasidim. Gypsies. We are talking about Italians. This is New York Times. This is New York Times, 1894. Do you get connection with the reality when you read this? And this again is that time, talking about Italians. And this again, that time there was a need of wildlife protection type of society. And this again, it's Irish. We were not alone. So these were the deep in our genes, unfortunately, the prejudice tend to lay and is built up. The relationship between migration and economic, macroeconomic situation is very important. And quite interesting, because when we are looking to migration, and then, of course, we are, as a public health, interested mainly to access to services, it's interesting to see that up to the 2008, roughly, there was a positive perception about the migration because of the economic turnout that was able to produce remittances going back to the country of origin, generating development, and in the country of arrival, generating income, increasing of GDP. When the migration, when the economic crisis started, there was a very important manipulation of the reality. There was a very important, politicians that are very able to read the tummy of the population. So fear, ignorance, lack of understanding, lack of real information, immediately identify the scapegoat in migrants being the responsible of the financial crisis. I don't have a job for myself, why I need to have a stranger come into my country to get a job? And those are the consequences. What kind of consequence we observed on the public health policies? That country went into restricting access to services, health services, selling this to the population, to the voters, as a very brave and the right thing to be done. In reality, from the public health point of view, really no sense type of intervention, because this means that you are creating a pouch of population which is not reached by services, particularly preventive services. And so this means that you are undermining the public health safety of your own country, of your own people. It's absolutely against to the principle which we are preaching when we are promoting public health approach. And again, the political polarization, the utilization of migration as a very important tool to generate consensus, for us has been a drama, because working at country level, we've been observing situations where, I'm talking about practice, I'm not saying reality, I'm not saying the country, but where we have been also escorted by security in doing our visit and working in the country while doing public health type of business. Or we've been engaging into negotiating with a country for months and months with certain countries in order to ensure that our work doesn't going to have any political type of aim, doesn't going to create any kind of embarrassment, but we are really like to establish a solid collaboration with the health sector and really to look into the public health aspect of migration. Public health and migration. I just made some references, I gave you some example on how lack of information or stereotype way of thinking, it's sometimes very well perceived by politicians and then utilized into a wrong type of policies, and now these policies limiting or heavily affecting the action of public health workers and public health sector. And this is extremely concerning. But if you're going to look to very, very concrete examples, because maybe the policy aspect can be a bit complex, it's very multifaceted, but let's look to communicable diseases. When we're talking about communicable diseases, actually there is a common believing that migration means bringing at home new infective diseases, because the migration phenomenon is a bridge between countries, developing countries and developed countries. So we tend to believe that we don't have any more dangerous diseases at home, we believe, but we believe that dangerous diseases are coming only from outside, and we believe that because you are different from myself, you are probably more risky to bring something that I don't like, including an infective diseases. And this again is a very old type of thinking. This actually during the plague in Europe, which has been killing 1/3 of the European population. Why? Not because plague arrived with a sailor or with a migrant, because there was not health system, because there was not a modern health system able to stop the infection, the epidemic. And again, at the time, Venetians, they invented the quarantine. If whom of you like to visit that city, there are still islands which they were utilized for quarantine, where sailors, travelers, they were kept there for 40 days in order to make sure that no infective disease they were coming to Venice. But Venice was without sewage, without running water, without public health services, without proper health services. So, which is the main reason why epidemic happening. No surveillance, no knowledge, not understanding. Is the situation changed today? Please play with me. Yes or not? In reality, when we look on media and we look to major traits, what is that? This is Ebola, an Ebola team in West Africa. Again, the association between Ebola and migration was almost an arithmetic type of association, very automatic, actually not supported by any evidence. And we knew very well. And in 2014, we spent it working with countries in diffusing, stopping fire of miscommunication taking place because of false outbreak declaration of Ebola imported by migrants coming from Africa. I'm going to conclude with a little bit more technical part. How to move forward, how to move out. Well, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a philosopher. I say we are country doctors. So the thing which we know how to do very well is to go to assess the situation, to collect evidence, to collect data, to analyze what is there, and to produce solid information and data to offer to policymakers, to communicators, to politicians, in order to make sure that the right decisions are made. And that's what we engaged since the beginning in 2011, in really going to the country, revising the health system functioning, collecting data, collecting even successful stories, even good practices, best practices. And there are many more assessments done so far, but in most of the country which we have been visited and we are working with, we discovered that the concept of the cultural element is completely neglected. Like it's not part of the work of a doctor, of the public health, of the health sector, which actually is the main part. Because if you go to the history of medicine, the observation and the cultural element is a very important element for the semiotic, for the analysis of the case, of the patient. And we don't do that with migration. And actually, when we're going to look at the situation in the country we've been visited, the presence of cultural mediators, for example, what we are calling technically non-health support services available in the health sector, is almost absent. There is a kind of leopard skin type of map, if I need to indicate on the map the country which they set up, they organize themselves, they load themselves with very well organized services and also schools, training center for cultural mediator are few countries. But interestingly, in many cases, they are not the country exposed to the large influxes. So the country which they need to face the critical, what we are observing today, the crisis situation. If we're going to look towards the Balkan route, probably the concept of cultural mediator is almost totally absent in the health services and health system of those countries. Is this important? Indeed, we discussed before, it's very important, also because it's helping healthcare workers to do the right thing. There is a huge gap of knowledge, and I'm discussing a lot with Claudia this, there is a huge gap of knowledge sharing, the need of sharing certain knowledge, particularly among healthcare workers, doctors and nurses. They are the first one getting concerned that, you know, a disease can come through migration. They're becoming irrational in the moment of pressure. So there is a gap, a cultural gap, a knowledge gap which need to be addressed, not only as a postgraduate, I personally believe not only as a postgraduate type of or continuous type of education, but this needs to be a pillar element of the education at the undergraduate level. We cannot anymore have the luxury to license doctors, GPs. They don't have a proper understanding of this diversity, because this is part of the clinical, what we call clinical part of the study, the anamnesis. So we cannot anymore be so traditional that we are generating doctors, putting doctors on the market, nurses, obstetricians, which they don't have an understanding of those concepts. I'm concluding with a few recommendations that probably there is a lot of work to be done, not only by the health sector, we are merely the users. Probably we need to look to the other sectors. In this office, in the regional office, there is a lot of work in this regard into thinking out of the box, going to other sectors, to engaging with, for example, with the educational sector, and promote what are the curricula, what is needed in order those people are actually useful. There are many issues which need to be addressed. I was reading somewhere some times ago that in UK, They have a problem that they've been recruiting a lot of cultural mediators because of the need, and now they're having cultural mediators on cultural and language and translator for language and culture which are not anymore needed because the migration phenomenon moved. So what is the right approach? To employ as a cultural mediator a foreigner, or to have also national trainer, or a mixed type of professional available in the country? I don't know. I'm just putting there as an open-ended question for your consideration. Or how this should be integrated and function within the health sector. We're supposed to start to do a little bit more risk analysis. I mean, we cannot think about migration, we ignoring completely where those people coming from, where they come, and what are the real risks associated to that. I like to repeat, in 2011, there was a huge political and media pressure on migration coming from North Africa to South Europe. And at that time, in Europe, we had outbreak of measles. European region is the exporter of measles. So basically, these people that were coming, because they were recognized as irregular migrants, economic migrants, they've been brought back, and probably we've been exporting measles back to their homes. So there are those elements which are so important now, not only at the level of, at the top government level, but also at the level of health services. We need to be able to have a proper understanding of the situation, and also to engage in a proper contingency planning. And not just to include, the last point, not just to include mediators in any health team, that's obvious, but also to really invest into evidence production and research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Santino. So with good time left, we've got about half an hour to get views from the room, get views from the internet, get people talking about this topic. If you've got some questions, we can do this the old-fashioned way, as I said. Raise your hand. We've got some mics. Please wait for the mics to come around, and do, if possible, identify yourself. Say your name, which agency you're from. That would be very helpful. We've got an online audience, so it'd be great for them to know. So we've got a question already. One hand pops up, two hands pop. Let's take the questions from the floor first, and then three. My goodness, and then we'll take some of the questions from online as well. Yes, please, Tim.
Thank you. I have rather a comment to the group. I first would like to thank Dr. Niels Fietje and our two panels for an excellent seminar. I think this topic is personally very much at my heart. My name is Tim Nguyen. I work in the Division of Information, Evidence, Research and Innovation under Dr. Stein. And this year, our division had the privilege to work together with Dr. Severoni to produce 3 reports on migration and health. And what cuts across in all these 3 reports is this aspect of cultural health. You know, this aspect of providing cultural sensitive health services. And these reports also pick up more examples on what can we do in terms of cultural sensitive health services. So I'm inviting you to read this report. We have some hard copies in the back for you, so please grab them, or they all also available electronically.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think we had a question from the middle there. Yes. If you raise your hand, you'll, yeah.
Hello, my name is Sudhe Sani. I work in the tuberculosis, HIV and hepatitis program here at WHO. I'm going to play the devil's advocate, but first of all, thanks for both presentations. So the devil's advocate in me says, working on infectious diseases, I'd like to bring 2 examples, recent examples. One is tuberculosis, and we have in all our presentations here at WHO, but also ECDC, that the majority of patients in Western Europe are with foreign origins. The second example is it's with regards to antibiotic resistance. I don't know how many of you followed that, because it was also widespread in the news, which was on the so-called New Delhi metallactamase gene 1, NDM1, which is a gene that makes bacteria resistant against third-class antibiotics, including carbapenems. This gene was interestingly found in a patient in Sweden who was sent to England. The patient had bloody infection, bladder infection, which could not be cured, and they found out that it was due to new resistance gene. The patient was sent to England, they did the investigation, and they found out about this new gene, and interestingly called it New Delhi metalloproteinase, which had the consequence that, of course, India was very mad, and on top of it, it came from England. So India was very mad because apparently the origin of that patient was Indian, or if I don't, he had a surgery in India. I don't remember anymore whether the origin was Indian. I think it was also even the origin was Indian. The patient has a surgery in India, came back, and so the roots they concluded goes back to India. Therefore, New Delhi metalloproteinase. It has had apparently large consequences for India because India profits from medical tourism. So it had a big influence for them. So, and I think these examples are going to increase more and more with increased migration. How can we deal with that? With people coming, including our own program and evidence that infectious diseases are also partly related to this issue. Sorry for this question. Thank you.
Thank you, because that's exactly what I was trying to address before. You indicated how many cases? 1 case, 2 case, 3 case. I mean, what is the size of I mean, if we are talking about public health, we are talking about big numbers. So I do agree. We are in a time and a moment where globalization makes movements absolutely extremely easy. And what you're saying is that the possibility that there is an importation of infective disease to Europe, it's observed, we know. We know that, for example, TB cases within European countries, they are mainly represented, there is a good quote of cases represented by newcomers to Europe. But if you're going to cross this information with a country, I'm talking about Western European countries, incidence of tuberculosis, this is in constant decline. How do you explain that? So we have more cases from out of the country, but if you are looking to the incidence into the country, it's a constant decline since the last 10 years. So this means that there is an health system which is functioning, which is curing cases that are decreasing. There is a demographic change, so it's absolutely normal that there are people infected, affected, which are not necessarily born in the place where they are living. The element which is very important, if we're going to look at the ratio of the rate of infecting residents, is probably close to 0, because these people, they tend to live also in a kind of their own context, let's say. Let me use these words. I would like to conclude, particularly the issue of TB is very dear to me, because we've been preaching for the last 20 years about global health, international health. I would like to challenge, what do we mean with that? Where is the shared responsibility that global health and international health was referring to? If I'm looking to communicable diseases, we understood since the time of Venice that to close borders, that's not the way how we control infective diseases. For this, we have the IHR 2005. So the issue is that we need to invest into inter-country, multi-country action, and we need to have a principle, we need to respect the principle of shared responsibility. So if we want to defeat polio, we need to immunize children all over the world. So if we have polio outbreak in India, is also our business. It means we need to do our own prophylaxis, we need to do our own public health choices, exactly to make sure that we are moving towards the elimination of infective diseases. This is true with all infective diseases. But the element of data is very important because newspapers tend to speak about 1 case or 2 cases or few cases. Let me give you an element of confrontation, because as a public health, we need to be able to juggle a little bit with numbers. A small country, I know because I've been checking that some time ago. I don't know if I need to mention the country, but a small country with about 3 million inhabitants in Europe, very bordering with Italy. the main airport, do you know what is the turnout of passengers into that airport? It's close to 1 million passengers per day. So as a public healther, should I think about public health preventions and measures at the airport where tourists, traveler, as we travel? Also, I'm supposed to be concerned about the 40,000 people crossed the border recently from the Balkans because refugees or migrants. So in terms of public health numbers, where I feel that I need to be more vigilant, more attentive, where I'm having a big numbers, where statistically the risk is higher. And that's what's going on. And this is regularly forgotten when we're talking about migration.
Can I just interject real quick and maybe ask you, Fern, if I distill something from this question, which I think is really interesting, and that is, I think it intersects with this worry about political correctness to some extent. When you have data, when you have evidence that is politically incorrect to some extent, how do you deal with that? How do you communicate that?
Well, firstly, I'm liking the fact that we can now be racist towards bacteria. Bizarre concept in its own. I just want to pick up a little bit, actually, on your point. Actually, if you look at the literature, the research literature in this area, certainly thinking about some of the intersectional research that's been done in the UK in terms of migrant health, actually, there is the concept of the healthy migrant. In terms of the cost to the healthcare system in the host country, migrants actually using services less than non-migrants within those communities. The impact on migrant health, when you start to break it down around migration status, is actually in the longer term when migrants are beginning to adopt Western lifestyle choices, and then that is raising costs in terms of obesity, diabetes, heart problems. So actually, we're the ones in Europe who are perhaps the health risk. So it's, if you're going to think about it in pure economic terms, that's more of a risk than, as you say, from an epidemiological perspective, people are moving all over the place. This isn't just migrants, it's tourists as well.
We had one more question in the back there. I think, Masha, you had a question?
I had actually a couple of remarks. My name is Maria Greenblatt. I'm head of languages in WHO Euro, also working under Dr. Stein. And we are kind of, I would say, first line of cultural mediation here in a way, because we are translators. I have an experience of working in the United States as an interpreter to Russian immigrants who didn't speak any English, and I worked with healthcare, mostly with blind people, with diabetics. And definitely I had to do some cultural mediation. And if you imagine that these are people not from Africa, these are people from former Soviet Union, so logically we had 100% literacy and pretty good, okay, healthcare. But I think that cultural mediation had to go not towards the doctors who didn't understand the patients, but towards also patients who had their own beliefs, their own enormous bias towards, in this respect, Western medicine. And what I experienced, that they were listening to the doctor, and then they were leaving the doctor's office, and they were saying, this is all BS, I'm sorry for my French, because they didn't believe this medicine. So now having this influx of migrants from very different world, how can we deal with that? The other thing that I wanted to say, I think that there is a very interesting experience in terms of different cultural backgrounds of immigrants, and I'm speaking about Israel, that actually had influxes from very different countries. And if you can imagine that the difference between German immigrant or Polish immigrant or Swiss immigrant, and the immigrant from Yemen is huge, especially in 50s and 60s. And this country actually did a lot of, let's say, in one generation to make it more or less equal in terms of understanding and understanding of healthcare, understanding of lifestyles, although these people still keep their own lifestyles. But I think that this is a very good experience that maybe can be used in terms of dealing with people of different cultures when they are coming to one specific place. Thank you.
I think you're entirely right, and I think that this is part of the reasoning behind starting to think about science as a cultural identity as well. I think when we're trying to engage across debates around science, medicine, belief, worldview, and that doesn't necessarily have to be organised religious belief. It could be, you know, an acceptance to, say, homeopathic medicine, for example. There's a need for dialogue between groups, and I think that's where there's a real breakdown. But in order to have that dialogue, we need to recognise the different factors in play in terms of the power relations with the authorities, the societal authorities that are potentially involving that dialogue. So to give a non-medical example, when we think about science engagement around genetically modified food, for example, in the UK, a big barrier to engaging with critiques, public critiques and public protesters about GM foods is that they are very easily written off as being a bit, shall we say, unrefined in their thinking, is probably a polite way to put it. However, they have legitimate concerns. It's just that they don't accord with the science perspective. And unless you actually have a kind of a space for dialogue, conversation that is respectful across both worldviews, you're just going to constantly have this kind of clash. And I think that's exactly the kind of intervention and kind of cultural intervention that might be more beneficial in the first context you're talking about. I think the Israeli example is actually quite an interesting one, because it's a really great example of the way that different identities can change when you move. So there's a research team that we were working with a couple of weeks ago who are looking at how Canadian Jewish people might move from Canada to Israel, and it changes the way in which they think about themselves. So they were originally thinking of themselves as Jewish Canadian, but then when they're moving to Israel, they're thinking about themselves as Canadian Jews, because they become a minority without realising it. So they can go from being a kind of majority context where they choose a minority identity to a majority religious context where they choose a minority. It's very confusing, and the way that people use these different cocktail identities changes depending on which group they're in. So that's also something we have to factor in. People don't have just one identity. They have different identities that play out in different venues, different contexts. So the cultural context is constantly shifting. We need to be aware of all of those kind of processes as well.
Okay, do we have any other questions in the room? We'll maybe take a few questions in the room at one time, and then we've got some, actually excitingly, we've got some on the internet as well, so we want to take some of those. So maybe three final questions from the room. We've got one here, one there, and did you, anybody else? So two questions.
Thank you. Claudia Stein, Division of Information, Evidence Research and Innovation. I have a question, and that's a concrete question, and I would not ask that question if Fern had not spoken first. So I'm very grateful you did. And that is, what does a cultural mediator actually do? How do you define that, especially in view of what Fern shared with us in this really strong interplay between what we consider culture and religion? And the reason I'm saying that is, if I think back of my own experience of being at some point when I worked in India and lived in India, being really, really sick for a couple of weeks with bone marrow failure, and the people in the hospital I worked with, they sent me different people to pick me up. First, they sent me Germans, which I'm German, which did nothing for me. These people were atheists, so I felt actually quite alienated. Then there was a couple of very nice English people who came and visited me, and I was getting a bit closer. But the people who lifted me up, who I felt culturally the closest to, were the Indian Christians. And when my church came to visit me, I felt I was culturally at home. Now, given this, is there such a thing as a job description for a cultural mediator? what would be in there? What would they do? And how do we then align that with the well-being of people? And this is the one piece I think is really missing in the WHO definition, spiritual well-being. How do we then get these people to be helpful? Thank you.
And I think we had one more question over here.
Hi, my name is Brooke. I'm an intern in the Strategic Partnerships Unit of the WHO Europe. My question, I guess, goes in line with Dr. Stein's, which is more about mental health and migrants and post-traumatic stress disorder and how the cultural implications of that are, taken into consideration. I guess when we think about migrant health, we think about the threats to us in terms of communicable diseases, but their health is also, they've encountered loss, deaths along the way. They've seen things that probably no 16, 17-year-old should have to see. And do we have the cultural competence to deal with that within Europe? Or if not, what are the policy implications?
So two excellent questions there. One, what is the job description of a cultural mediator? And then the kind of flip side of the coin, yes, cultural competency for doctors, very important, but how do we actually deal with the flip side, the kind of health experiences of migrants?
Okay, two very interesting and very difficult questions. Thank you, and that's a good thing. In terms of the role of a kind of a cultural mediator, I think it's more about complexity of thinking. So really, what we need to do is work with people who are involved in any form of kind of delivery of service, policy making, decision making, those kind of things, or the people who are involved in these kind of mediatory roles, to understand that things aren't black and white. It's not as polarized as people tend to think it is. There's a number of projects that have done this in certain areas. They don't tend to relate to science and religion or medicine and religion or those kind of aspects. Predominantly, the reason I'm smiling is because this is work that's predominantly been done actually in terms of work with thinking about terrorism. So there's been some work that's been done in those areas that I think could provide interesting models. There's a lot of caveats with that. There's some bad work that's been done there too. So I think that really in terms of thinking about cultural mediators, it's about how you train people to think in a less black and white way, and that's both people who are accessing services and providing services, in order to be able to recognise and speak to each other in terms that are both reciprocal and respectful, and understand that in some cases compromise might be needed. There needs to be a third way sometimes. In terms of mental health, you are entirely right, and this is one of my big concerns in terms of thinking about the role of religiosity and personal identity, is that if you're moving from a situation that has been incredibly traumatic, and this comes back to the healthy migrant. I mean, a lot of migrants are quite healthy because the journey they've had to make here means they couldn't have made it if they weren't healthy. This is a very, very complex set of things where you've got people who are coming from very, very traumatic situations, potentially from very fragmented social groups, who are then put in a situation where they are in a minority in multiple ways. So the discrimination isn't just about where they've come from, their migration status. It's to do with their entire worldview and framing, which means that you're actually tending to get people more strongly hold on to those kind of identities. So it becomes very complicated. And what concerns me is that there are underlying processes going on that we don't yet recognise properly, we haven't researched fully, that might also be adding to that. So kind of increasing the impact of that discrimination and the original trauma itself. So re-traumatising.
Yeah, difficult questions also because we are talking about work in progress in many cases. We are talking about experimenting these professional profiles, defining. I would like to try to somehow at least partially reply to your question, Claudia, saying probably we should look at what is needed actually when we're talking about access to services and a person of different culture. And in many cases, the health system barrier faced at the access, they are very similar to the one that the national it's facing. Probably we have a language barrier. So there is an issue of communication, and here, in many cases, you see that profile of cultural mediator is unbalanced toward translator rather than cultural mediator, which is a different type, could be also be an IT-based type of service, doesn't need to be necessarily a person for a translation. Oh, sorry, Masha. The other element is the navigation into the system. Let me again play a bit with you. I guess everybody experienced at least once in their life that they need to go for a CT scan, for an X-ray, for an ultrasound. The first discussion at home was, do we know a good doctor? Which center are we going to go? Do we have a friend which can help us to have a short waiting list? Do we have a friend which can direct us to a good doctor? So that's navigation. That's analyzing the options to make a good choice for your health. So is that institutionalized? We are trying, the health system tried to institutionalize that for the users in the health sector, but when we are inserting a person which doesn't speak the language, different culture, doesn't know the place, doesn't have a social tissue to look for support, situation is becoming very complex. Any colleague which is not Dane probably has been going through this experience here in Denmark every time they need a doctor, because simply you don't know where to go. The last element, it's really enlarging the healthcare worker knowledge. I like to use as example a personal experience. I was preparing for the license to go to get a specialization in US. I'm not saying how many years ago. And I was impressed by the fact that it was compulsory an examination called behavioral science, which was really describing very well how to take into consideration all those variabilities related to culture, gender, religion, when you are practicing your professional, your clinical work. And this in Europe was almost unknown at that time, at least where I was coming from. So I think those are the three elements we're supposed to take into consideration when we are looking into this defined curricula. There is an additional complication. This is not, so far, has been dealt mainly as a continuing education. I mean, something which the health sector has been tried to, a gap which has been tried to fill it up. Probably there is a lot of work which needs to be done together with the educational sector, because this is supposed to become a profession, supposed to become probably something, a specialization of the social workers. I don't know, I'm just thinking loud. Mental health. In a bit provocative way, I like to define mental health, the most common type of health issues in reference to migrants, which almost nil addressed, almost entirely neglected. Okay, let's be honest. Those are people on the move, so it's very important to identify where to provide certain services. So those are mobile people, and it's very difficult to engage into this type of business, mental health related issues when people are basically looking to resettle. I think there is a lot of misinformation about. There is a lot of reference to post-traumatic disorder, a lot of mental disorder related to migrants. If I'm looking to the media and also scientific article, all migrants are supposed to be mentally disturbed, because it's always there. So what I'm trying to say, we don't have enough evidence. I'm making echo to Tim. Probably we need to start in a very humble way to revise what is the situation, to really look at the issue from a very bold point of view and try to address it. In my view, mental health as chronic diseases, they require a strategic positioning. What before was mentioned in relation to non-communicable diseases, there is a lot of emphasis about the impact that communicable diseases can have on the health system because of migration, which I say before, it's mainly ungrounded. In reality, we are almost not considering what is going to be the real health spending for the first generation of migrants, which they are going to be largely exposed to risk factor because of lifestyle, because of nutrition, because of lifestyle conditions. So those will be, unfortunately, most probably non-communicable disease type of patients. And mental health certainly is there. It's a very important element, but I think we need to do a little bit more in that.
Thank you, Santino. So having a look at the internet here, there's a way to star certain questions. So we don't have that much time left, but I think we should take the couple of questions that have been voted up, as it were, by our democratic audience online. So the first question here that has gotten quite a lot of likes is, how can your research, Fern, and I guess more broadly social science research, research from the humanities, into different faith communities interact with science, into how different faith communities interact with science and medicine, be useful for public health policymakers? So if you can just maybe very quickly, both of you, give your perspective from the research side and from the application side, just very briefly, so we can get a couple more questions in.
You like these tough questions, don't you? Okay, so I'll think about the kind of very top level. I think one of the most important things that concerns me is that we're working in a data vacuum, and a lot of assumptions are being made, and a lot of those assumptions are based on preconceptions, prejudices, and kind of mistaken perceptions, should we say. So really, I think a lot of the work we're doing at the moment is trying to unpack some of the mythology around the way that people might think about science and religion in order to challenge some of those perceptions. I think you give a great example, actually, of perception change with your article from the New York Times in terms of challenging how we might think about different groups. So I think that's where possibly the work we're doing at the moment will be most useful in terms of providing the empirical evidence to kind of unpick some of the things that might be leading us to make prejudicial assumptions within certain contexts in terms of policy making. Obviously, the other thing that we can do is provide rich data. A lot of the work that's done tends to be quantitative, which is great, but it doesn't always give you some of that kind of deeper kind of understanding of how individuals' lived experience might kind of interact with some of these issues in terms of, I think there's a real need for kind of more mixed methods work that looks at cultural context, both geopolitically, but also from individual and group perspectives. Qualitative, social psychology, historical work that gives us a broader picture than just the top level figures can. Obviously that's tough, and it's not easy to do in a comparative way over a number of countries, but hopefully that will also give us slightly better information about how we can build practical interventions or ways of engaging across groups that will lead to more positive healthcare and well-being outcomes.
I agree with Professor Fern.
Yeah. Good. Then we can take another question. Excellent. So the other question that's been liked a few times is about religious beliefs. So religious beliefs are obviously an important issue in the migration crisis, but is WHO best placed to advise on these issues?
We need to agree. We need to agree that we need to have easy question if you want easy answer, short answers.
Well, this is potentially yes/no answer. So
not yet.
Okay, I'm gonna have to press a little bit more. Why not yet? What are we waiting for?
Well, this is very much linked with the question of before, where we are trying to, especially this region, we are trying to switch from a concept of health to well-being, which is much beyond the caring of diseases. It's really well-being, and we are in continuous evolution. I'm in this organization a few years, and only a few years ago, I would never imagine that this topic would be on top of the agenda of the region. So that's my no yet. If this is going to be key strategy for the public health work, why not?
Okay, well, I think we've probably reached the end of this seminar. We've overstayed already a little bit. We do have a tremendous amount of really interesting questions from the internet. I wonder if we can perhaps, well, maybe we can find out a way of continuing this conversation online, or thinking about ways and how we can answer some of the other questions that have come in. But I do have to draw this seminar to a close. It's been a real pleasure listening to both of you and to the questions. I'd like to thank the University of York again, the Collaborating Center for Global Health Histories, WHO Collaborating Center for Global Health Histories at the University of York, who've done a tremendous job at organizing these seminars and putting together the speakers and so forth. Thank you very much to them. I'd also like to thank the Wellcome Trust, who funds these seminars and these seminar series. And I'd like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank you for coming, for asking your questions, for being engaged. We will be organizing more of these seminars in the next year, probably in the summertime. And please do, by all means, do join us again. We're very interested in your feedback about what we can do better, what worked, what didn't work. If you like the way of interacting with the seminar, so please send me an email at ghhistories@euro.who.int. But that's it for now. Thank you very much, and please one more round of applause for our panelists.